day, everybody. Welcome to Barnyards and Backyards Live. I'm Jeff Edwards for University of Wyoming Extension, and my co-host, Jeremiah Vardaman, is joining us. Good morning, Jeremiah.
Morning. How we doing?
Good. I think hopefully we miss out on technical difficulties today. Our guest today is Karen Panter. She is the horticulture specialist from campus at Laramie, and Karen will be talking with us about shrubbery. But before we do that, Karen, just a moment. For those of you who are new to Zoom format, if you have questions, and we encourage you to ask questions, if you hover over the screen with your mouse, at the bottom of the screen, there will be a couple of buttons you can push. One is the chat button or the Q&A button. Please type your question in there. We'll bring it forward to Karen. We'll try to get it answered for you in either one of those. If you're attending and watching on Facebook, please use the comment section, and the comments will be pulled forward and answered as well. The fourth person that I would like to mention, which I forgot, is Jenny Thompson. She is also from UW Extension, located in Laramie. She is assisting us in making sure that things run smoothly today, and will be possibly you might hear her but might not see her. So thank you, Jenny, for being here. So Karen, welcome for joining the show, and if there's anything else that you would like to add in your introduction, please do so, but I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, everybody, for having me. Yeah, I'm horticulture specialist here. I've been here almost 24 years, and my job is one of those that has a bunch of different components to it. So I have a large extension component where I do a lot of this sort of thing, and writing and speaking and all that, and a lot of diagnostics too. We have a diagnostic team that I should mention as well that deals with plant problems. I work with our entomologist, Scott Shell, our plant pathologist, Bill Stump, and our other horticulture specialist. Actually, we have two others, Jeff, and then the other one that we work with on the diagnostic team is Chris Hilgert. And we have a weed scientist if we need one. So we have a real good diagnostic team that I spend a lot of time with during the growing season. Actually, it never stops anymore, to tell you the truth. We get questions all year long. So
and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, that's good. And the other half of my job is split between research and teaching, and I teach several horticulture courses. This semester is plant propagation, which is a lot of fun, very hands-on. So. All right, well, today the topic is shrubs. And I guess one thing to mention initially is what exactly is a shrub? How do we define that? And there's several words or phrases that come to mind. One is woody, one is perennial, and another phrase that you can use is multi-stemmed. Some shrubs are multi-stemmed, but certainly not all, but they are also much smaller than our trees that we normally think of. So there's several things that we can use to define what a shrub actually is. They are actually part of the landscape design scheme, of which there are basically 5 components, starting from the ground up. We have our ground covers, turf, and there's also a bunch of other different types of ground covers, some vines like creeping myrtle and things like that. A little bit larger than that would be our herbaceous annuals and perennials, our flowering plants. The next topic or section of landscape plant material is actually vines, and a lot of people just completely ignore vines there, which is too bad, because there's some really nice ones out there that actually do fairly well in our Wyoming climate. And vines need more attention because that's an integral part of any landscape. The fourth would be shrubs, and then the largest component of the landscape would be trees. And those can be, of course, the woody stuff can be either evergreen or deciduous. And we can answer questions about those later on if you like. But those are kind of the designations of what a shrub is and where they fit into a landscape. They also have a lot of other uses as well, not only ornamental, but wildlife attractants, They are integral parts of any urban landscape and can actually be used to a great effect in rural landscapes as well. So with that, let me share my screen.
So while you're doing that, Karen, you'd mentioned that shrubbery is usually smaller than trees.
Right.
So is there a height difference between trees? And I know there's a lot of overlap. There's some literature you'll read or some publications that you read that say, it's a shrub or a small tree.
Right,
But
right.
is
And
there
that's,
actually definitions on that?
yeah, there are some that actually can be utilized as shrubs or small trees, and robinia is one that comes to mind, which is in the pea family. And it's the purple robe is the variety that came to mind almost immediately, but that can be grown either as a single stem small tree or as a multi-stemmed larger shrub. A lot of it has to do with how they're pruned initially.
Oh,
But that's a good question. Yeah.
and then the single stem versus multi-stem is another differentiation, if I understood you correctly.
Right. And there are a lot of our shrubs that are true shrubs that are single stemmed. They don't arise like a lilac will produce numerous stems from the crown of the plant. But there are others like the viburnum that I showed you just initially, or some of the horizontal junipers, those are single stemmed. And so there's not a steadfast rule, but usually we're looking at smaller woody plants that are the shrubs. So.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, good question. And please feel free to jump in with questions and feed them to me as we go along. I spend a ton of time not only teaching others in the state and elsewhere about horticultural topics, but I spend a ton of time in the classroom as well. And students are usually pretty happy to ask me lots of questions. And so being interrupted does not.
We're not afraid to jump in and interrupt. Don't you be worried about that.
Okay, good.
We'll interrupt you.
Somehow I knew that. Yeah. Anyway, this is me. And the easiest way to reach me is by email, and my email is actually quite simple. I am in and out of the office a lot, and so between teaching, which I don't do here on campus, so we have a greenhouse about a mile or a mile and a half away where I spend a good chunk of my time. And then I still work from home occasionally. So phone messages do get to me. They follow me on my cell phone, and they end up actually in my email. So if you do have something that you want to send a voicemail, that's fine. Email is by far the easiest way though, because I have access to that pretty much anywhere. So. All right, some of the resources that I wanted to let you know about include some of the extension bulletins. We have an excellent resource room, shall I say, online that has a ton of bulletins on all sorts of topics, not just horticultural. And a few of them relate directly to shrubs and how we manage them. This one Chris and I redid a couple years ago. I think the latest date on it is 2015, so it's probably needs updating again. But this one includes information on how to plant selection. There's a table of recommended plants that will manage in our Wyoming climates. And so that's a resource that we point people to frequently. And on the cover there, that's Forsythia, which unfortunately doesn't do very well in Laramie at 7,200 feet, but at lower elevations in Wyoming, it's just fine. It's a wonderful shrub. Early spring flower. We also have a bulletin on fertilizing trees and shrubs. So if you're interested in reading that one, that's a little more technical. And it doesn't include information about managing trees with fertilizer. So that one is also available. And then winter watering. We spend a ton of time talking about winter watering because we have many people who move to Wyoming from other parts of the country where this is a completely foreign concept. And out here, our climate is so dry, unless we winter water, we will lose an awful lot of our perennials, trees, shrubs, herbaceous plant material as well, and ground covers such as turf. So winter watering is crucial. And so this bulletin talks about that and the timing and things like that. But winter watering is something we pretty much have to do, especially if the plantings are new. For those first few years, while the plants are getting established and the roots are growing and developing into the soil or where they've been planted, that winter watering is absolutely essential. And then this one is from our neighbors to the south, Colorado State University, and I spent 10 years with CSU Extension, so I know that system pretty well. And this bulletin is actually a really good one for how to prune various types of shrubs. I will not open any of these online because it gets a little confusing, but suffice it to say that this Garden Notes number 619 from Colorado State University Extension is terrific. And it's got a lot of diagrams and photos in it to show you exactly how to prune various trees and or shrubs, not trees, shrubs. So with that, are there some questions I can answer yet?
Not at this, well, I think you've kind of covered our main ones. We had a question off of Facebook before the show started prior this week. And so Sandy asked, she was fantastic to see this topic. We just moved here last year from Wisconsin and have an extremely steep front, I believe they mean front yard, where we need to plant some things to avoid erosion. I'm considering barberry and Russian sage, but any suggestions would be great. So I think just diving into those publications that you talked about is a great start to it. But I don't know where they're located in Wyoming, though.
Oh, okay.
Did you?
Yeah, steep slopes are tricky because oftentimes trying to irrigate them is really difficult because the water just runs right off. So anything that you can do to capture either irrigation water or rainwater or snow is going to be very helpful. Barberries are much maligned, shall I say. There are some varieties have actually been outlawed in various states because they are so invasive. There are a few that and I'd have to look up the varieties again. I didn't do that, but there are a few listed in our recommended shrubs bulletin, which let me look up barberry. If I can remember the Latin name, I'll be in much better shape. I think we have a few listed in here. It'll take me a while to find them, but there are very few that actually we recommend for landscape use. The other thing about barberries is that they are host to a rust fungus organism, which also attacks wheat, if I remember correctly.
They're also host to aphids that overwinter in them too.
And so this is another reason that we are a little iffy about barberries. They're gorgeous plants. They're very pretty landscape wise and just aesthetically, they're wonderful shrubs, but they do have some downsides. And they are hardy, which is both a plus and a minus in their case, because they can be grown in a lot of places in Wyoming, but beware, they do have their issues.
Well, and your comments about planting on a steep slope, I mean, if you're trying to prevent soil erosion on a steep slope, grass is usually one of the best to get established on a big surface, but that can be challenging as well. On the comments of what you said, keeping that water on that, it just wants to run off no matter what,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
But if you were to go in, it would be more, it might be cost prohibitive or more expense to the effort, but contouring that steep hillside to slow that water up and to not let it run off, you could have a easier time establishing grasses, maybe getting shrubs and trees to grow on that steeper hillside.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Terracing.
Terracing or, just anything, and even when if you did want to use a few shrubs on a steep slope, you would want to plant them so that they have a kind of a moat all the way around the plant that's built up so that the water can actually stay put around the shrub where it needs to be. And so you can kind of semi-terrace each individual plant, but that's a lot of work. Terracing the entire yard is also a lot of work, but that would actually alleviate a lot of the issues. Turf grasses are always, helpful in a situation like that. There are other types of ground covers that could be utilized. And so if we wanted to get into that, we can do that at different times, since we're not talking about ground covers today, really.
Yep.
But there are a ton of them out there that would actually help to hold the soil and moisture as well. So,
And both, right?
Yeah.
Like combining those. Yeah.
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. You can be creative. Some of our best ground covers are actually quite gorgeous. And even yarrow, some people have used yarrow, Achillea, as a ground cover or as a turf alternative, and you just mow it like you would your bluegrass lawn. So that's one kind of interesting, but I digress.
Yeah. There, we got another question off of Facebook from Sherry. What is a fast growing shrub, preferably an edible?
Edible shrub. The edible shrubs that we have include gooseberries and currants, and they're actually closely related. Raspberries could be used, or they're technically shrubs. And that a lot of raspberries actually, and Jeff knows about all that stuff, the small fruit thing. But raspberries are relatively fast growing once they get established. As with any plant, after the first 3 or 4 years, once they're established, then they often take off. So those come to mind almost immediately. There are some of the prunus, for genus prunus, which includes a lot of our choke cherries, and those are edible. A lot of the prunus varieties are actually, not only varieties, but species are edible. And let's see, what am I missing? Those are a few. And prunus actually do really well in our climate. They're once they take hold, they're really difficult to stop. So some of the prunus shrubs actually are pretty fast growers.
Well, and it's kind of relative, right? So I think you touched on it. We're talking perennial woody plants with shrubs, and so they're gonna take a while to establish, and so it'll take a minimum of a year, if not more, to get established before you get good fruit production, no matter which one you choose.
Right.
I would consider at least the first year, if not 2, your establishment years. And once they're established, then you can start looking at growth and production of the fruit.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Our next
Totally true.
question is from Anna. Will watering when we have unreasonably warm spurts cause them to leaf out too early? I've been nervous to encourage growth too early when I know a cold snap is following the warm days.
Water is your best defense. Keeping the soil moist is your best defense to help your plants withstand the cold temperatures and the temperature swings that we have. Dormancy in plants is very much more complicated than just water. It has to do with, and we get this question a lot, but I'm a plant physiologist. And physiologically speaking, it takes a heck of a lot more to get plants out of dormancy than just adding some water to the roots. It's much more complicated. It has to do with temperatures. It has to do with day length. Moisture in the soil is a minor component of it. And there is absolutely no reason to not water when the temperature, this is where that winter watering bulletin comes in, because it helps to explain, I know you can't see it, but there it is. Unfortunately, with the background blurred, it doesn't
pick up.
I can't show you handouts and things like that, but this right here. Anyway, but that is one thing that we explain in there. And the thing about keeping the soil moist is that water changes temperature very slowly, and it actually helps to kind of insulate the roots against damage from not only temperature swings, but also physical damage, because as the soil dries out, it cracks and heaves, and it will actually physically damage your root system of your plants. And so keeping the soil moist, especially during the winter, is by far your best defense in order to keep them alive for the next growing season. So watering in the winter when the temperature gets over 40 degrees is what we typically recommend, and there's no snow cover. Get out the hose, especially if it's a new planting. You are not going to bring the plants out of dormancy.
Well, and even this time of year in the spring, right? We've been pretty warm. Then we hit this week and it's a cold snap and that. But anytime, I guess my recommendation, very much off what you just said, Karen, is anytime that temperature is warm and the ground is thawed, we need to be encouraging putting water down. And the caveat I always buffer it with is, but do not jeopardize any of your water source, right? Hydrants, that we don't want to freeze any pipes. We can freeze water in the hose. That's fine. But we don't want that hooked up to a hydrant, especially a house or a well, especially for domestic use. So don't jeopardize those pipes and your water source. But if possible, when possible, irrigate.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
So great. Our next question is from Marla. How do I deal with alkaline soils? I think she's saying Uinta County. I think she lives in Uinta County. What shrubs grow?
There are quite a few. The ones that we have listed in the shrub bulletin are ones that we suggest for our lovely alkaline, and they're alkaline all over Wyoming and all up and down the Rocky Mountains. This is not unusual to Uinta County or Wyoming. It's quite common all up and down the Rockies. And there are a bunch that will actually handle our alkaline soils, including some evergreens, including junipers, Mahonia, which is a broadleaf evergreen. A lot of the mugos are actually quite tolerant of our more alkaline soils. And then as far as the deciduous shrubs, some of the artemisias or sages are actually quite alkaline tolerant. Carragena pea shrub, which is a real common one that does really well even up here in Laramie. There's a ton of them around Laramie. And that's another one that will handle our alkaline soils. Cotoneaster. There's quite a few that are listed in here. I could go through. And in the comments column, there will be a section, there's a section there about any quirks of the particular plant. And sometimes if it's alkaline tolerant, it will be mentioned in that comments column, but there are quite a number that will actually do quite well. The other thing that you can do, well, you really can't. I was going to say something about amending the soil, but the thing about amending the soil, and which is a whole nother discussion with trees and shrubs, is that the American Society for Arboriculture recommends that if you can't amend the entire landscape area, don't amend it at all. And so what that means is, especially with new plantings, if you can't amend the area where those roots are going to be growing, leave it the native soil that it is. And adding good compost, good organic matter, a good peat moss is another one. But you have to be a little sphagnum peat moss. You want Canadian sphagnum. That can be added. You can also use some types of compost. The problem with compost, however, is it's not consistent. And depending on what went into it, you may end up with problems with it coming out of it. High salts, sometimes there's herbicides in the compost. We run into that almost every year. We run into herbicide issues in compost because of lawn clippings being put into it. So compost is not compost is not compost. So be very careful with compost. But any good organic matter like that is good quality. And if you're not sure, you can have it tested, at a soil testing lab before using it, just to find out even two things, the pH and salt levels in it.
So Karen, you briefly touched on, but when you say amending, can you just give us an explanation of that, a definition of that, just so we know, just so anybody online that doesn't know what amending the soil
right, and that's amending is just adding more additional components to the native soil. And you can use organic material, like I just mentioned, compost or Canadian sphagnum peat moss or something like that. Leaf mold, if it's been composted properly, will work, things like that. Then there's other inorganic components, things like perlite, which is a naturally occurring mineral that you find in a lot of potting mixes for indoor plants. And perlite is something that will kind of fluff up the soil and will add some aeration to it, which is a good thing with our heavy clay soils that are also tend to be a little alkaline. So it's just adding components to the soil to improve it. One thing I will say, do not use sand.
Why not? Why do we not want to use
Sand is large particles, and our soils are typically very small clay particles of actual soil. And when you add a large piece of component to a small component, you end up with concrete. And so we do not ever recommend sand, ever.
No, yep, you'll make a natural concrete within that, and that's more detrimental than
you will be very sad. So avoid the sand at all costs.
Well, and alkaline soils are hard, and you handle this a lot. We handle this a lot through extension in the state. This is a very common question. The difficulty with alkaline soils, very much like Karen said, is you cannot make a significant impact to that small site, and it's definitely not a long-term effect. And so just economically, it's not worth it unless, like Karen said, if you can change the entire landscape that planting is going under. So very expensive and not necessarily worth it. And
nope.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions. Have I missed any, Jeff?
No, I think that's all that you have.
Yeah, there was one that I saw that kind of popped up on my chat here about bearberry, and the initial question about the steep slope may have been bearberry instead of barberry. Okay. They're very different things. Bearberry is Arctostaphylos, and that's a native plant that's kind of an understory shrub. It's wonderful stuff, and that will also work, but it's also more of a shade-loving plant. So you have to have some way to provide at least part shade with bearberries. If you think about where they occur in the mountains, they're an understory in forests. They're shaded most of the day, if not all day long. So that's something. Plus, they like it a little more moist. So you have to kind of play with how you're going to treat something like a Arctostaphylos.
Great. All right, let's get back on your PowerPoint and see what's next.
Okay, great. Can do. All right. It says I am screen sharing. Sweet.
Yep, we can.
Okay, awesome. So the next slides I have are just some examples that I pulled from my library of photos, which is, as you might guess, a little bit extensive. And this I just wanted to show you because this shows some very different, and I don't think, oh, there it is. Just some different ways that shrubs can be used in the landscape. In this particular case, this is an apartment building, and this is on the north side of it. My parents used to live right over here. But there's some shrubs over here that are nicely used to kind of soften up the area around the brick building. And then some sheared shrubs over here, which if there's questions about pruning, we can certainly get into that. And they're just nicely used in more of a formal way in this particular case. And you can kind of see some fall color back here and some others. They also have some ornamental grasses and things like that in this particular area. This is one of my favorite shrubs, and it is listed in here. Viburnum is the very last one. They're alphabetical by Latin name, but viburnum is, there's a number of different species out there as well as cultivars. This one happens to be in my backyard and it faces northwest, so it's very protected. We have several in the backyard and another one on the side of the yard that I'll show you later. But they're very distinctive, tough as nails, do really well as long as they're protected. And these do prefer a consistently moist soil. So we do keep them, we throw snow on them all winter long. if there's snow on the ground and you end up with bare spots in your gardens, just throw some snow on them. I get a little irritated frequently when I'm driving around town and I see people shoveling their sidewalks and their driveways into the street. And I know Nebraska needs water too, but the best thing to do, if you possibly can, put that snow around your shrubs and trees and in your gardens where it can do some good. So we're constantly adding snow to around our plant material.
Yeah, Karen, I'm a big fan of viburnums. We have a variety of them in our yard and in our landscaping, and it takes about 3 years for them to become the bush that you think that they should be. But they take trimming very well. They generally have a really nice shape to them. The flowers on them that they're produced, it's just a really nice all-round shrub for a lot of Wyoming.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, and they're a little slow grower, which is actually a good thing. Someone asked about fast growing shrubs, and my thinking on both fast growing shrubs and fast growing trees is avoid them because they're very brittle and they break very easily. And cottonwoods are a classic example. They're fast growers, but they're also very messy and they drop branches constantly. And they're just, so the slower growers are more sturdy, the wood is tougher, and they're not nearly as susceptible to breakage as some of our fast growers are.
Some of the earlier ones, sorry to interrupt, some of the earlier ones that we've put in, they're now over 10 feet tall. So
nice. Yeah.
They're just doing really well.
Yeah, they're awesome. Yeah.
We had a couple questions come in. So we have a question from Kit. Can I prune my lilacs now, or should I wait until the fall?
If you prune them now, you will remove all of your flowers. So no. We can talk a little bit more about pruning later, but the rule of thumb with lilacs and any spring flowering shrub like forsythia and lilacs come to mind immediately. You wait until just after they've finished blooming and then prune them. Because what happens with these spring bloomers is that they put on their flower buds for next year, later this summer and early fall. And so if you prune them now, the buds were set last summer, you're going to remove all of the flower buds. So if you want any flowers, wait until just after they've finished blooming and then prune them.
You could probably remove dead material at any time within the bush without any detriment to the flower or next
exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, actual pruning of live material, you want to wait.
Right. Yep. The rule of thumb is you can, with pruning, remove dead or crossing or rubbing or insect or disease infested wood at any time of year. But for flowering, like a lilac or a forsythia, you're going to want to wait to do any major pruning until after they've bloomed. Yeah. But the dead stuff you can get rid of anytime. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Our next question
totally
is.
Right.
Our next question is, do elderberry shrubs grow in Wyoming? And this individual, Becky, is from Washakie County.
Yeah, elderberry. And of course, I want to say Sambucus. Yes, they're listed here up to about 8,000 feet. So Washakie County, no problem if that's around Worland. Yep. They're rated to zone 3, which is nice. But they do prefer full sun. But yes, Sambucus is one of our recommendations. Yes.
Great. That's the questions I see right now.
Okay. Oh, and Jenny did remind me too about barberry. The Latin name is berberis, B-E-R-B-E-R-I-S, and they're rated to about 7,000 feet in elevation. As you know, any of us who have been around the Rockies for any length of time, elevation is everything. And so we did list the elevation limits on the various plant material listed in that particular bulletin. So this is the viburnum flowers, and it is a spring bloomer, and we don't really prune these things at all except to get rid of dead wood periodically, and that's about it. We've also noticed that we have some bird feeders in the backyard, not too far from this particular plant. And the birds love to hang out in the viburnum. They think that's great. It provides a lot of really good cover for them, and they really like that. Lilac, of course. And there's a zillion different lilac varieties and species, and you could just go on and on and on about lilacs, and they're tough as nails. This particular one is on the west side of my house. We have kind of a fortress. It's kind of funny. We've got this lovely cinder block wall around the backyard, and a lot of the houses in our neighborhood were built with those, and I'm still kind of scratch my head over that, but whatever. Anyway, this lilac was there when we moved into this house in November of '98. And so this is at least 25 years old, if not older. And it just does its thing. It's perfectly happy and it blooms every single year. It's just a real pretty one. I have no idea what variety is. Good luck trying to figure it out. But lilacs are almost, excuse me, impossible to get rid of. They're really tough.
We have a question, Karen, from Shirley. Should the branches of a ribes aurarium, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, I'm not familiar with that one, that are low and laying on the ground be removed? It's in the Q&A box, Jeff.
Okay.
Ribes. Well, it's probably, some of those actually are naturally
golden currants. So
yeah, and some of them naturally do that. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It may not produce much, and it may just be a nuisance and get in the way. I don't know. It probably just depends on what the rest of the plant looks like. And if you're using it for fruit, you might want to get rid of that particular branch just because it may not produce much. Jeff might have an idea about that too.
Of your choice of if you want to leave it natural, that's a natural growth habit of the plant. But like you're saying, fruit production, we usually want to get that up off the ground a little bit at least to be more conducive.
And, there are certain small fruits, shrubs that like my son has blackberries in his backyard down at Fort Collins, and those things are just very droopy, and they naturally just kind of what we call weeping. And that's actually one way that they actually reproduce themselves. The ends of the branches will actually end up on the soil and will root and develop into a whole new plant. And so that's a reproductive thing for a lot of our ramblers, actually, like blackberries. But the ribes are a different thing. So yeah, it's up to the homeowner if they want to get rid of that or not.
They had a follow-up question to that they were curious if the contact with the ground would be a pest or insect issue vector, basically.
It could be. There are a number of insects and diseases that attack a lot of our brambles, our small fruit shrubs. And anytime you're close to the ground and you're using overhead watering, there is the potential for pathogens to be splashed up onto the foliage. There's always that danger. The good news is that in Wyoming, we don't have as much disease pressure as there is in other parts of the country, just because our climate is so dry. But yes, that can be an issue.
So we have another question off of Facebook from Sherry. Do shrub roots affect drain fields and wells?
Of course.
Yep. So you want to keep those away from water lines if you're aware of where those run, of your leach fields, sewer pipes, septic systems. You want to keep them a good distance away from those. Off the top of my head, I want to say, I think the general recommendation is at least 100 feet away from those, but I could be wrong, Karen, but you don't want to plant it on top of it for sure.
Yeah, it kind of depends on like this lilac here is too close to the house, but we gave up worrying about it. But usually the recommendation is you want to plant it 1.5 to 2 times further away from the structure, whether it's a sidewalk or a house or whatever. or a leach field or whatever you're trying to deal with. 1.5 to 2 times the mature height of the plant away from the structure. So it will vary according to the plant size.
Perfect. Another question is, what is your opinion of buffalo berry? That's a loaded question for you, Karen.
It's a loaded question for me if you really want my opinion.
Yeah, that is a loaded question. It is on our list, Shepherdia.
It's a native plant.
It is.
Does well in Wyoming. It's great wildlife habitat. It's thorny. It's nasty. It can spread. What have I missed?
There's not a lot of redeeming characteristics other than the fact that it's native and drought tolerant, and it will handle our alkaline soils, obviously, because it is a native. But a lot of people really do not like it. It is messy. They're not the greatest specimen shrubs by any stretch.
Apparently, if you have a lot of time and the willingness to make wine out of them, it's a very good product to have, apparently.
Yeah, that would take a lot of berries to get wine out of that.
Yeah.
Man. I guess I see buffalo berry more as if you're out in the county area and have large landscape and you want to have some wildlife and some good hardy shrubs that are on the landscape, they're great that way. I don't tend to see buffalo berry in a residential area on a small lot, anything that way. They're a good shrub. They have their place. I think it's more of the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my husband is a horticulturist landscaper too, and he refuses to deal with them. So,
we have some in a hedgerow along a road that's a great place for it. I've had some in my landscaping, and those are no longer in my landscape.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree with Jeremiah. They just need to be out in in a rangeland situation where they have some space, can provide some cover for wildlife.
For the berries of buffalo berry, do they need male and female plants, or are they self-pollinators?
That's a good question that I can't answer. I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. So you need to look into that. If you're going to do buffalo berry, look into it. Make sure if they're all the comments I'm seeing come through, everybody's kind of thinking that they're male and female plants, but we're not sure about that. Check into it if you're going to go plant them. Yep.
I'd have to look that one up.
All right. I think that we got the questions again, Karen, so we're ready to continue on.
This is the coolest plant. This is a variety of mugo pine called Tannenbaum. And it doesn't get it's more of an upright mugo than a lot of them. If you think of a mugo, oftentimes we think of something that's more of a rounded shape, multi-stemmed maybe. And a lot of mugos don't really like it up here in Laramie. But this particular variety, Tannenbaum, has just been tremendous. And we actually bought 2 more, and we're planting them in our front yard. Mark, my husband, just brought them home the other day. And this is a nice shrubby type of a pine that is just fantastic. It's done really, really well in our backyard. And that one gets partial sun, it gets morning sun, and then over on the side over here, this is west over here-ish, there's a whole bunch of large spruces and cottonwoods in the neighbor's yard, so there is protected from a lot of the wind, and that really helps too. So that's a mugo Tannenbaum, and that would be classified as a larger shrub. And then we have our horizontal junipers, which have their places, but they don't really, for some reason, they are really difficult to get established, especially up here at 7,200 feet. At lower elevations, they do a little better. But these are actually form a real nice, many of them are only a few inches in height. And so actually form what you might even call a ground cover. But this is a really nice type of shrub that definitely has its place in the landscape.
Karen, we had a question on the mugo. Is it at risk of pine beetle?
I don't think so.
Great.
No, it's not.
We have another question from Anna on, would buffalo berry be a good windbreak candidate for rural subdivision? It's probably not one
Sure.
I would, yeah, it can be. I don't think that would be the first one I would think of for a windbreak, but it could be used in that fashion. I think, again, it depends on where the windbreak's going to be and how close to everything else you want. But it is a pretty dense shrub, a small tree, that it does provide a good windbreak if you get enough of them.
I think one of the negative qualities that we have to keep in mind is that it is a spreader. And if you don't want that in your windbreak, then it wouldn't make a very good candidate for a windbreak.
Right.
Yeah, it'll move. It will move. So especially if you are watering it, right, really keeping it well hydrated, fertilizing it, pushing that growth, which we do on windbreaks usually because we want good growth. And so it's going to tend to spread even more aggressively because of that added nutrition and ability. So yeah, no, it can be used. It's again, personal perspective.
Yep, just beware.
For windbreaks, you can contact the your local extension office, but also a really good resource is our local conservation districts.
Mm-hmm.
They have, or the NRCS as well. They have a great list of what trees make good windbreaks, how to design that windbreak, and they also sell trees for windbreaks specifically. So check in with your local conservation district.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, Karen, what's next?
Well, let's see here. Philadelphus or 9-bark, which is another one that does pretty well. And this one is actually right outside our greenhouse door at 30th and Harney, UW campus here, where I spend a good chunk of my time. And the foliage on them is purple, which is kind of nice. It does add some color, and the bark on these things is also quite interesting. It's very papery. Well, it's not thin, but it's papery, and it kind of shreds off of the stems, and it's a real interesting plant. And this is another one that I really like. After a while, they do look a little scraggly if you don't keep the dead wood pruned out. And this one obviously needs a little attention, but this is another one that we do recommend.
One of the things I like this one too, Karen, just because of the foliage is such an interesting color, and the bark as well. But it's a flopper.
It is, yeah.
And to me,
what do you mean by flopping?
It's a personal thing for me. I like my shrubs to grow upwards.
Upright. Oh, okay.
And this one, its limbs get out so far, and then it just folds over. So you have to have enough space for it where you plant it, so that you're not mowing around it or mowing through it, and it will occupy a large space. So. Yes. But that again, that is a personal issue that I have. So other people might not bother.
Right. Yeah, that is true. It needs a good 6 or 8 feet in diameter, 3 or 4 feet on either side of the crown of the plant to actually provide the best area for it to grow and develop like it normally likes to. It is a flopper. You can see the stems bend down. And,
drooping habit, right?
Yep. But they're very hardy, very sturdy, pretty cool plants. I like those. Sumac. This is another one that people have a love-hate relationship with. Some of the sumacs are very aggressive and will spread very easily through offshoots and suckers. Some don't do that. There's a number of different species of sumacs and varieties as well, but they do provide, this particular one is in my son's backyard here in Laramie, and it dies back to the ground every year, every fall, and then resprouts from the root system in the spring, and it's got a real pretty fall color. It's bright red, maroon, very nice. So sumac. And just another example of a more formal way that you can use shrubs. I couldn't tell you specifically what some of these are. Looks like a spruce small, maybe a bird's nest spruce over here, and some other maybe potentially dogwood here. But they can be spread through the yard to make a very, very nice stepwise progression from your ground cover to your flowering plant material here to the shrubs. It's kind of a stepwise progression up to the big formal planter on the patio there. And so you can actually use them to draw your eye to various parts of the landscape that you want to highlight. And so that's another way to use shrubs. And this one, I've always liked this one. This is not in Wyoming, this is in Denver, but this particular, I think this actually may be a barberry shrub here, and it's sort of pruned properly, but sort of not. Usually with hedges, you want to, most people prune them this way so that the top is wider than the base. The problem with that is that the top part of the hedge gets all the sunshine and the bottom part doesn't. So you end up with this very leggy open space down at the base of the plant. If you prune them so that they are narrower at the top than they are at the bottom, that allows sunlight to get in, penetrate into the entire plant, that whole hedge, and you'll be much happier with the way they look. And most people don't prune hedges properly, but this one is not too bad. And the way I like this because it kind of offsets the ground cover turf here, and then you've got your shrubs and then these wonderful ornamental grasses that I'm not sure what grass, those might be pampas grass actually, to tell you the truth, down in Denver. And then of course your next larger component, which would be the trees. So I've always liked this little landscape. And what the other thing is that it kind of hides the fence behind it. And there's a road behind that. Dogwood, which is wonderful. This happens to be red twig dogwood, Cornus sericea, and which grows really well all over Wyoming. We have a bunch of it over by the greenhouse. We use it in my plant propagation class for stem cuttings because it will root very easily from stems. And then there's another shrub over here that is sort of pruned properly, but you can kind of see that at the top of that particular hedge, there's much more foliage than there is down at the base towards the bottom of that hedge, which is kind of the opposite of what we'd like to see. And this one is a YEWU. That's the common name. The Latin name is Taxus, T-A-X-U-S. And it is listed, I think, in our bulletin. Let me double check here. Yep. And it's very cold hardy, but this is a broadleaf or narrow leaf evergreen, and it does have a tendency to brown out with our winter winds. And one year, a few years back, this is what this one looked like after the winter. You can still see a little snow down here, and this can happen with YEWs. This is on the northeast side of our house, and it is protected back there from most of the wind, but not all of it. And so this one took a little bit of a beating. It's still there. They're actually older than, I would say, probably 30 years old. They've been around for a long time.
Karen, we had a question on the dogwood. Marla off of Facebook asked, how much root depth is needed for dogwood?
Root depth?
Yeah.
Well, that will depend pretty much on the quality of the soil that you're planting it into. Most people are under the impression that what you see above ground is mirrored underground by the root system, which is not true. Most root systems are more horizontal than they are vertical. And so these roots will actually spread quite a ways, but they are not a suckering plant. So where you put them, they will pretty much stay, which is nice, unlike the buffalo berry and a few others, the sumac. But they will penetrate as deep as the soil allows them, either with moisture, as deep as the soil moisture goes, And also there is an oxygen limitation. Roots have to have oxygen, and so they don't penetrate very deeply in our heavy soils because they can't get the oxygen they need. And so a lot of times there will be much more spread horizontally. They will, of course, go down a little bit, but a lot of it is dictated by the structure of the soil that you're planting them into.
Well, and it kind of, that's the biggest misperception that I hear all the time on especially perennial woody plants, may that be shrubs or trees, vines. Everybody believes their roots just go deep, super deep in the ground, and that's just not true. They're very shallow rooted plants, really. The top 3 feet approximately, just depending on species, and soil conditions. But because they're so shallow rooted, and depending on what the landscape is around them, and needing extra water can be a big proponent of those plants. So we have another question from Roxy. Do you recommend using rubber mulch or something more natural?
I'm not sure what you mean by rubber mulch. Anything like that, if it doesn't break down. And so as a result, it can actually impede soil moisture and oxygen penetration into the soil. So anything like that that is not going to break down or decompose is a little iffy. It depends on the situation. There are areas where you might want to use something like that, but in our climate, something was of plant origin initially, something that's organic. And by organic, I mean being of plant origin, having been living at one point in time. There are a number of different definitions of organic, which is a whole nother discussion, but I'm just talking about things that were living at one time. And oftentimes those are a little better simply because they do decompose and they will improve the soil structure and texture over time.
And they keep the soil cooler than non-natural things, gravel in particular is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, gravel is really iffy. If what gravel does is it forms heat islands, and it just reflects all that heat and light to the plant material around it that may be planted in it, and creates all sorts of issues that you probably had not intended.
And yeah, and it retains a little bit more moisture than non-native, and so that's usually why natural sources are recommended over that.
Right, and and actually can keep the soil underneath too moist. I could have showed you this picture that just came across yesterday of some horizontal junipers in Wyoming that are in gravel, and one of my questions was, what is it really wet? And the symptoms were the plants are completely chlorotic and yellow, and which can be a symptom of either overwatering or underwatering on a juniper. And so, it can keep the soil too moist.
Great. Do you have anything else? I don't see any more questions at this point.
Okay. I think there's just a couple more slides. And this is the viburnum in fall color. Another plus for viburnum. This one is on the east side of the house, and they all do this. We have several viburnums, and they're just wonderful in the fall. So I think that's the last one. So, yep.
Great.
Yeah. Oh.
Well, let me see. So there's another question. Is there a resource guide available to help me propagate dogwoods?
Oh, they're easy. Yes, there is, and I have a ton of them. It's just stem cuttings, 4 to 6 inches long. It's very simple. You want to have 3 or 4 buds on each cutting, and you can actually root them in water. They root real easily. It will take some time, a few weeks, and you'll need to change the water frequently. Or you can just root them in a good potting mix that has sphagnum peat moss in it. They're very easy to root. My students love them because they are able to get results within a few weeks on the dogwood.
Don't need any rooting hormone or anything like that on them, do you?
It's helpful, but it's not essential. Not with dogwood. Others you pretty much have to, but
Sure.
not dogwood.
Sure. Can you do air layering with dogwoods?
You could, sure.
Probably in a more controlled environment than outside in Wyoming, right?
In the summertime, you could do it. Yeah.
Okay.
Air
And what-
layering is just a specific type of propagation that it's not difficult. It does take some know-how, but it's not hard to do. And yeah, you'd need a, fairly thick stem in order to do an air layer on it. But yeah, that would work, definitely.
Can you explain air layering a little bit to us? If it's
in
too
a few
technical,
words.
we can point people to a reference.
Well, no, well, yeah, I can, but it's the textbook that we use, which is called Plant Propagation. And I think it's the 9th edition of the book that I've been using for many years. But what it is getting a new plant to grow and root while it's still attached to the parent plant. And it is done with rubber plants, fig trees, that kind of thing. You could do it with dogwood. But what it involves is wounding the stem by girdling it usually, and then covering that with a moist section of sphagnum peat moss, and then covering that with foil or something to keep the moisture in, and then covering that with plastic or something just to keep it all together. And eventually what will happen is that girdled area, you remove the bark, will develop new roots. And as soon as you see the roots starting to show through the plastic, then you can cut off that stem and you have an entirely new plant. But layering, what layering does is produces a new plant while it's still attached to the parent plant.
So you can use the parent plant nutrients and resources
Right.
to grow the new plant, basically.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic, Karen. That's all the questions I see. We really appreciate your time and energy and expertise to bring it out to our clients here on Barnyards and Backyards Live. We always enjoy having you on the show.
It's always fun. Thanks. Oh, there.
Oh, did we get another one? How and
There's a
when is the
carragana.
best way to trim a carragana? I have one that is very spindly.
That's what they do. Yes. If you want a wild and crazy plant, put in a carragana. Their growth habits are just all over the map. And just prune out the sections that you don't want. Anything that's dead, you can prune out anytime at all. They're very forgiving, and they bloom later, so you can go ahead and prune it now and not worry about losing a bunch of flowers. But yeah, you can prune those pretty hard actually, and they'll bounce right back. So they're tough.
Great. Thank you, Karen. And
All right.
yes, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to close out the show. I want to thank everybody, our participants, for joining us today. And as you know, we record these shows and we'll post them back up on Barnyards and Backyards website. So you can search that, find that. And on that Barnyards and Backyards website, you're going to find a lot of things. So you can see the button over on the side that says Treasure Trove of Information. There's tons of information, and Jenny dropped the link in the chat box that would take you directly to Trees and Shrubs. Also, our Barnyards and Backyards live show is there as well. And on there, we have the recorded sessions, and then we try and link as much of the resources as we can at there. So it's a one-stop shop for you. You can watch the show. The resources that we highlighted are linked right there, so you don't have to go out and search for them. And then we do have a few more shows left for this month.
Just one.
Oh,
Just
I thought
one.
we had two. Yeah, one more. Yes, one more show. So choosing small livestock for your place. So please join us next week, and we will catch that last show. But we're really glad to have you. We've mentioned for our extension offices, we have extension offices all over the state. If you have specific questions, want to get access to those publications, or want contact with Karen or other horticulture specialists with UW Extension, please stop by your extension office. We have one in every county and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation. Then the last thing is, we always do this show for you, our clients. And Jenny has dropped a link in the chat box or in the comments box, depending on how you're joining the show. And we would love to hear feedback on the shows. We do these for you, and so we do pay attention to those and would like to hear from you of what we can do better, or maybe some topics that are of our interest to you that we have not covered yet. So, and then with that, I'm gonna just bid everybody a great Friday afternoon, enjoy the weekend. Hopefully it warms up enough that you can get out and do a little bit of yard work and not freeze down too bad. So with that, thank you very much.